Okay, today is April 16, 2014. 10 days ago, we took a look at Derrida's grammatology, which was his entire phenomenology as a system. But it didn't really address his concept of logos. And during that same period of time, when he published grammatology, he also published a collection of essays entitled Writing and Difference. They were published by the University of Chicago Press in 1978. And in the series of essays, the first three essays addressed his doctrine of logos. So we want to take a look at that and get to a little bit better detail, and that'll help us complement his position that he gave us in the grammatology. And we'll look at it within the same framework of the psychology of postmodern thought. So we'll take up the semiotic work of the sign modeling and the unconscious, and the semantic work of the cognitive consciousness. And by examining both sides, we'll take a look at the way that he specifically addresses logos in each of those moments in order to tie it together with the grammatology. And it'll give us a much better understanding of his position, because we find out that Derrida, by proposing a phenomenology of deconstruction, wasn't simply interested in deconstructing metaphysics. He was also interested in deconstructing a distorted view of reason, and he blamed that distorted view of reason on the classical period, the birth of the Socratic period, and the Socratic idea of logos, which Derrida felt was a distortion of the pre-Socratic notion of logos, which was a more authentic and pure rendition. And the way he looked at it is that basically logos in the pre-Socratic period enclosed within itself all differentiation, and that there was no dualism. Basically, the logos included within itself the otherness of the excess of being, and so there was no external duality that defined reality. But then during the Socratic period, the classical Greek period, the term logos came to presume a hard defined duality, and it took two terms. It took logos and it countered logos with hubris, and hubris is normally translated as pride or arrogance or presumption. And so this arrogant presumption was the counter concept to logos, which was reason. So it was a type of reason versus madness, reason versus an arrogant type presumptuous madness. But the mistake, he said, was that initially logos took otherness as the counter concept, as a positive concept and not a negative concept. In other words, otherness wasn't hubris, it was a hyperbole, and hyperbole is the extraordinary of otherness. It's the what we would commonly call today transcendence, but it was the excess of otherness as the extraordinary factor that accompanied all reality. And so initially logos contained within itself its own difference, but that difference was a stretching beyond the mundane toward an extraordinary aspect. But the classical Greek period distorted that and posited a duality, including a negative interpretation of otherness, and ended up taking hyperbole and replacing it with hubris. And so Derrida, when he discusses logos in this volume of Writing Indifference, he's very much interested in revealing how an authentic postmodern position needs to recapture the primary purity of the term logos and deconstruct the distorted version of logos that was born in the Socratic period and that has been adopted throughout history, and especially during the 19th and 20th century with idealism and the metaphysics of that idealism. And so Derrida's not just opposing metaphysics per se, he's actually opposing and wanting to deconstruct a distorted view of reason as a kind of a determinate, omnipotent force. Reason is not this metaphysical dominant force, but instead otherness needs to be reclaimed in its positive aspect of the excess of being as a hyperbole instead of hubris. And so we want to take a look at how this works within his basic system of phenomenology. And we're going to start with the unconscious. And by starting with the unconscious, we will take a look at that very first moment of when we deal with the units of meaning that we're going to label as percepts. And Derrida says that basically we want to neutralize the distorted units of meaning that have been contaminated by metaphysics and a false understanding of reason and a false understanding of logos. He says we need to initiate a returning to the common origin logos where reason and madness coexisted together within the logos in the pre-classical period. He calls this reaching the 0 point. We need to reach the 0 point of the elementary discretion, which results in a deconstruction and a negation of the metaphysical reason of yesterday. In that way, he says that we actually, the self will actually confront the neutralized determinate historical units rather than the contaminated determinate historical units. And once they've been neutralized, then the self can actually label them authentically as named percepts. And so he says initially there is this appearance of a madness, the wound of violence that opens up true historicity through a prohibition of existing metaphysical reason. And we discovered that original, what he calls the original haunting. And it says we get back to the neutralized, pure units of meaning in a situation, we will rediscover their original haunting, which is their original accompaniment and embeddedness of this excess of otherness, this kind of a trace of transcendence that accompanies the given, that is part of its inherent nature. And so this haunting madness will become ever present again, to be appropriated by the self, and we will be aware of the possibility of this intelligible aspect of reality. And that gives us a chance to transition to the next step, where we want to do that moment of what we discussed in grammatology as that auto-affecting figuration, where we took the units of meaning and formed them into a figurative overall unity. And as applied to the logos, Derrida says that we need to take up the concept of embedding. And basically he says there's a narration of totality that is embedded in the neutralized percept units that we have acquired. Now at this stage, he says we're still in the unconscious, and the project of thinking, the cognitive work of actually articulating a conceptual model, is still in its latency. We're not still at that point. So here we're still involved in metaphorical figuration. And the figurative narrative will be the metaphorical narrative of the excess of a directional sense that is embedded in our perception. So Derrida goes on to say that this embedded narration of totality is going to be evoked through that auto-affecting process of the self-actualization of the power of the traces that we do acquire. So it is this turning in toward that motivational base of the self, accompanied with the traces that we acquire through our perception of acquiring the neutralized units of meaning. And Derrida says that all determinate cognitive knowledge must of necessity pass through this stage of the figuration of madness. The figuration of madness, this more motivational psychic side of truth, more of the Sophia wisdom than the gnosis type wisdom, is an essential stage, this stage of figuration, where we do consider this tangential presence of the excess of being, or the otherness of being, that coexists within the concept of the rational logos. So we reach this moment which Derrida calls the cogito. It's the figuration of the meaning of cogito, escaping any false duality of reason and madness that was set up in classical Greek, in the classical Greek Socratic period. But we're still individualistic here, so we want to transition to the cognitive realm of actually forming a conceptual sign model. But in order to transition to that realm, we pass through the moment of dialogue with others who are also interested in this existential stance toward the deeper significance of meaning and existence. And that we have called in the past the Dokunta threshold, where we do the refinery work of refining the metaphorical model into something that can function as a sign model of deeper significance. Now here we are going to pass through the moment of what Derrida says is the break with madness, where we adhere to essence. But he says that partitioning is not a hardcore partitioning of the non-essential from the essential. He said it's really a partitioning that is a separation only by a transparent sheet, where there's still this visualization of that from out of which we have emerged, where we still have this, when we transition to the conceptual, we still can recall a hint of the figurative, a hint of the emotive and motivational. The partitioning is only due to a transparent sheet and not some hard-lined separation. But by engaging in this dialogue that will help to refine our notions, our measures, and our percepts, we're able to evolve to deeper meaning for each of the units of meaning. We're ready to assign an actual conceptual sign to those units of meaning, and that takes place when we actually enter into the cognitive realm of consciousness and pass out of the unconscious motivational base. So we pass into the cognitive. We're going to begin by articulating the notion of the true, and the notion of the true is that realm of an internal externality. So it's a positing of what we consider to be the truth that we put at the forefront of our mind, that functions more or less like a filter or a window through which we view our external world, and it's our articulated conceptual model of what we consider to be the truth of external actuality. Now, Derrida says here in this volume that the philosophical axiom, "I think, therefore I am," is the moment of the notion, And it is the formulation not of a metaphysic, it is the formulation of a conceptual project. A project that we propose for actuality based on our notion of the true. It's based on a pre-comprehension of the infinite narrative of the totality of reality, of being. And he says that we employ a tangential perspective, not the straight-on logical analysis of a situation, but a tangential perspective that actually wants to acquire those trace elements that are present of the excess of being, those moments of transcendence. So we function outside the factual norm, and we actually take up a stance of living in what he calls the margins of madness. We take up the stance of living in the margins of madness and want to appropriate these traces of the excess of being that make their presence known on the periphery edge. But he's also quick to point out that in this positing of the notion of the true, we abandon the classical concept of hubris completely. We've stripped it away, we've deconstructed it, and we discard the concept of hubris, and we replace it with the initial positive concept of otherness, which was hyperbole. So we reappropriate the concept of hyperbole as the extraordinary surpassing of the normal gnosis of the mundane type logic, and we instead appropriate the extraordinary, which is this trace of the excess of otherness, but we view it in a positive sense as a hyperbole, and we don't view otherness as a negative duality that exists in actuality. So we have discarded the concept of hubris. So logos can finally be articulated now as a conceptual sign model. We have a formal articulation of logos. And that puts us right on the hinge pivot point of our cognitive consciousness, where we simultaneously will be conscious of and embrace the imaginative side of our existence in the unconscious, and the cognitive side of our existence that stands ahead of us as what he calls a morphology. He calls it a morphology because we're actually going to we want to transition out of the ideal notion of the true into the praxis, ethical practice or volitional ethics of that same notion. So now we're going to transition into action, and that transition into action is a morphology or an intent to transform and create a metamorphosis of our actuality as a correspondence to the posited notion. Our goal is to reach an eventual correspondence to the posited notion of the true. So we want to transition from imagination to morphology. It's an eschatological stance. And we will posit primarily a structuring of signs. It's basically a syntactical structure that we want to posit. And it will contain the signs, the themes, and the praxis correlate. He says whenever we get ready to transition into this practical side, we take the conceptual notion of the true and we create a praxis-based morphological correlate to that notion. A praxis-based morphological correlate to the notion for a practical positing. And remember, praxis means action and reflection within a concrete historical situation. Action and reflection within a concrete, particular historical situation. In other words, it's true, being truly situated in our historical environment, and not, and we don't have an idealism that evacuates reality. We have an idealism that actually engages in praxis and in an epistemology that is based on action and ethics. So ethics informs epistemology. So we do create a praxis-based morphological correlate to the articulated conceptual sign model of logos. So we have sign model of logos. We also have morphological correlate of logos. And with the morphological correlate of logos, we're ready to move in to the actual work of ethics, the semantic side of building the sign model within actuality through a dialectical process. And Derrida is very good on images, I think. He came up with a beautiful image when he discussed the magic slate, the child's toy of the wax tablet with a cellophane that you pull up. That was a beautiful illustration of the postmodern subjectivity. Well, now he gives us a very good image of what does it mean to practice this dialectical process of actualizing a morphological correlate of logos. And he calls it the visualization of a helix. He said a helix is if you want to look at it as a spring-type helix, it's an ascending type series of circumference circles that diminish in circumference as they rise up. It's a helix, so it is a diminishing circumference as it ascends. And that's a good illustration of this dialectic, because in this dialectic we eventually don't want to have any circumference. We want to have an absolute correspondence, and that would be actually reaching a pinpoint. So for Derrida, he says the best example is to think of the helix type coil of an ascending diminishing circumference, that as it ascends higher and higher, the dialectical circle becomes tighter and tighter and tighter. So it's a good visualization of this helical opposition that is descriptive of the dialectic of our positing of this morphological correlate, which is a very praxis-based correlate that truly does want to grow in an epistemological understanding through an ethical action. So this ascending helix will progressively enclose, and subjectivity is always taken up within the process of trying to morphologically change actuality. It will also involve a metamorphosis of subjectivity in the same work. So objectivity and subjectivity both are engaged in this mutual morphological correlate that has been posited. And whenever Derrida gets to this point, even though he's discussing logos overall, from an overall point of view, he's taking us through the phenomenological model at the same time. And by doing that, he is going to come into next this question of empowerment. And when he enters into the question of empowerment, or the formal moment of logos within this overall discussion of logos, he does have something very specific to say, and he basically outlines the triad here. He says that that pure primary logos was the logos cogito, and it combined logismos, reasoning or rationality, and it combined it with hyperbole as a positive otherness as an excess of being. That was the initial elementary logos in the pre-classical period. And it enclosed reason and madness within itself. It allowed for the transmission of language. It allowed for the possibility of history. And it allowed for the emergence of determinate figures of meaning. It is the Descartes cogito moment. And he called it and Derrida calls it the archaic reason of the free trade between this logismos and hyperbole. Logismos as rationality, and the hyperbole of the excess of otherness are engaged in a free exchange or free trade within this archaic reason. Now, the second moment of logos, as it is formally considered, is the classical period, the logos classical. Now, it combined logismos, rationality, with hubris as a negative otherness, as the presumptuous basic. It's a presumption of otherness or pride. It's commonly interpreted as pride, but it's logismos versus hubris, and it's set up as a duality that exists in subjectivity and objectivity. So the significance of a positive madness is reduced to silence, and primacy is given to logismos. Rationality becomes a dominant, omnipotent force. So madness is paralyzed in this classical view of reason. And Derrida calls this determinate reason or omnipotent reason of logos. And then he reaches his model, or the postmodern model of logos. And he said it's going to combine logismos, rationality, plus hyperbole, but it's going to be, in the postmodern sense, it's subjective. It's one thing that Derrida, as well as other postmoderns, oppose, and that's the over-objectivist interest of all of the projects of 19th century idealism. It was an overly objectivist type of an interest, especially with Hegel, and postmoderns want to correct that with a subjective emphasis. And so for Derrida, the logos postmodern is going to combine logismos with subjective hyperbole. We include the psychological concepts. We do employ rational language, but it's only used to develop this subjective hyperbole strategy. And the objectivist project of the classical logos is deconstructed and rejected. The objectivist project of classical logos is rejected. And we re-engage the primitive, primary, elementary logos of the logos cogito. And in this way, Derrida says we are to be empowered by a logos that overcomes the duality, the false duality, between reason and madness. But instead we take up a logos that has internal within itself all oppositions. So his empowerment is fundamentally going to be subjective. And the way he kind of describes it, it's kind of a migrating subjectivity that actually will migrate into actuality, and that through the morphological correlate, and then return to the self, where there is a continual closing of the helix opposition, the further that we ascend through this dialectical process. So empowerment is primarily subjective through the power of the subjective self taking up the traces of otherness as the hyperbole, taking up the hyperbole moments, traces, that we find through our tangential stance rather than a straight-on logical stance. And in that way we appropriate the trace of otherness, and we turn with those traces of otherness in toward our motivational base, where all of our stored traces are still held in memory. And through an associative process, we empower the signs of our sign model. And all signs are self-actualizing signs. They actualize themselves within their own power of language. It's an illocutionary type of force that they possess, which is basically the force that promissory language possesses. And then we'll look at one little final part here, and we'll have this wrapped up. in the end, he does want to also mention that the Logos, in conformity with his grammatology, is going to address this re-elaboration that we need to take part in, because the entire phenomenology of deconstruction is aiming at re-elaborating the writing of the history of tradition. A history of tradition which is eschatological and involved in movement. And he calls this the book of reason. So the Logos is going to be the taking up of the hyperbole traces of the excess of being and subjectively empowering the entire dialectical helix type process. But the Logos is also going to be an actual writing of the book of truth, which he calls the book of reason, the book of the Logos. We're actually going to write this sense of meaning, and that means to write it through actual written documentation and also through speech act. And so basically you end up with a proclamation and differentiation, two modes of exscribing that which has been inscribed within the self. We exscribe through this the proclamation speech act or the differentiation act of ethics or documentation. And he says that it all begins when you consider Logos as the book. It begins with the Logos as reflected in itself, an objective yet abstract notion of a law-type Logos. It was the originary speech, the originary text. He says that for his example, from his Jewish perspective, it could be exemplified metaphorically by the broken tablets. And this represents a differentiation within the Logos itself, and it allows for a displacement as speech infinitude to take place. There's space made within the Logos, but through this rupture of the Logos within itself, to allow room for finitude, and for finitude to speech in a speech act and in a writing act. And so there is a rupture within the Logos. There's an interruption of the Logos voice that will now go out of itself and into finitude, and then through a gyro lifting of its voice up through finitude, it will return to itself in its unity of purity. And so the second moment is going to be the second moment of the Logos book is going to be the finite writing, and it will be the actually at the same time it constitutes, as we've already discussed, a finishing of subjectivity. It is a maturity of subjectivity as well as a morphology of actuality. And here Derrida says, he actually makes a statement that self is the substance of the Logos. So here he tells you subjectivity from his postmodern perspective is equal to the substance of the Logos. And the self gets involved in a poetic, subjective autonomy of writing the aletheia truth of the eternal and raising it up through the finite, through this positing of the morphological correlate of the notion of the true. And all of this takes place so that the self can eventually evolve to that point of writing the book of the Logos, the raising up of the spirit through the finite, and it becomes an objective writing of new tablets of the Logos, unifying the exiled and empowered self of the Logos. And it will evolve out of a series of ruptured eternal speech acts that create the temporary moment of violence when they actually disrupt and disengage all units of meaning from this false concept of reason that they have clung to, this classical view. And we've been so dominated by this classical view that we even unquestioningly take up its metaphysic, and it contaminates the very purity of the units of meaning in our history that we live in. And so, again, from the point of view of his grammatology, he's saying, as far as the logos is concerned, we have to take the same perspective. In the grammatology, he says we need to negate, deconstruct false metaphysics in order to work toward a new re-elaboration of the truth of spirit. And in this series, he says that we need to deconstruct the false classical logos in order to reacquire the logos of the cogito and to get back to the purity of a positive otherness instead of taking up the old Socratic hard-lined duality of a positive and a negative and clinging so rigidly to hubris. For Derrida, we reject the concept of hubris and we embrace the concept of hyperbole. And hyperbole basically is the Greek concept for all that postmodern thought centers on, and that is the excess of being. The Greek concept for the excess of being is hyperbole. So hyperbole is the concept that Derrida wants to embrace, the key concept that Derrida wants to embrace for his logos, for his doctrine of logos, and everything is centered around reacquiring that concept and re-elaborating its meaning. And that's about 30 minutes. That'll give us a little supplementary information on logos to tie together with the previous lecture on grammatology.